We'd been in the business for generations, selling dog meat at the edge of the city where no one asked too many questions. It wasn't glamorous, but it was profitable. People came for our family's famous cuts, and we knew how to get them fresh. My father had taught me everything I needed to know: how to catch the dogs, how to make it quick, and how to never look back. The job seemed easy enough. A stray had been spotted near the old railway tracks, a place we often scouted for untethered dogs. I took the van with my cousin Tu, just like we always did. The night was hot and sticky, the kind where the air feels heavy with the promise of a storm. We were parked by the tracks, the headlights casting long, eerie shadows through the brush. Then we saw it. The dog, if you could even call it that, was sitting at the edge of the tracks, half in shadow, half in light. Its coat was matted and patchy, black with patches of grey, but it wasn't just its appearance that made me uneasy. The way it looked at us. Its gaze was intelligent, almost human, but colder. Much colder.
That one's big.
Tu muttered, tightening his grip on the pole we used for snaring.
Might be a fight.
Its eyes were locked on me, as if it knew something, as if it had been waiting for us. My stomach churned, but we were too far in to back out. I nodded to Tu, and we moved in. As we approached, the dog didn't flinch or snarl like the others would. It didn't run. It just sat there, calm, its eyes never leaving mine. I threw the loop around its neck, expecting a struggle, but it didn't move. Tu looked at me, confused, but I didn't have an answer. We dragged it back to the car. It didn't put up any resistance.
Well, that was easy.
Tu said, a grin spreading across his face. But my gut told me something was wrong. Very wrong. Back at the shop, we locked it in the cage overnight. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes, staring back at me. I told myself I was just tired, that I'd caught one too many strays and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the next morning, when we went to butcher it, my hands trembled. The dog was still sitting there in the cage, watching me. Its eyes hadn't dulled or grown afraid. They looked sharper, almost like they were cutting through me. Tu handed me the knife, but as soon as I touched it, the dog's lips curled back into the slightest of grins. I froze. Dogs don't smile. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. Tu laughed, thinking I was being soft. He grabbed the knife and went into the cage. That's when the lights went out. A blackout wasn't unusual in our part of town, but this felt different. The shop filled with a smell I couldn't place. Something metallic, something wrong. I heard a low growl, followed by Tu's shout. Then the sounds of struggling, metal clattering, a sharp yelp, and then silence. When the lights flickered back on, Tu was lying on the floor, blood pooling around him. His throat had been torn open. The cage door was wide open, but the dog was nowhere to be seen. My stomach dropped. I rushed to Tu, but it was too late. His eyes were wide open, frozen in a mix of horror and confusion. My hands shook as I grabbed the phone, but when I dialed, no one answered. Not the police, not anyone. It was as if the line was dead. That's when I heard it, the slow, deliberate tapping of claws on concrete. I turned around, and there it was, standing in the doorway. The dog, no longer mangy and weak-looking. Its fur seemed thicker, darker, its eyes glowing even brighter. But worse than that, it was standing on two legs like a person, its mouth curling again into that unnatural grin. It took a step forward, its claws clicking on the floor. My legs wouldn't move. What are you? I whispered, my voice barely a tremor. It cocked its head, as if it understood me. Then, it spoke. Not in words, but in a low, guttural growl that echoed inside my mind.
You took them. Now I take you.
It was a nightmare. Just a nightmare. I sucked in deep breaths, trying to calm myself, but the lingering terror clung to me, an unshakable sense of dread.
Sienna,
My mother's voice called from downstairs.
take the food out to Rex.
Of course, the one task I hated more than anything. Feeding the dog in the garden. My garden. The one teeming with snails and slugs, their slimy trails glittering under the sunlight like some grotesque display. I groaned, but pulled myself out of bed, still shaken from the nightmare. I hated slugs. More than hated, I was terrified of them. Molluscophobia. It wasn't just disgust. It was something deeper. A fear that rooted itself in my bones. An irrational terror that made me freeze at the very sight of their slimy bodies. I grabbed the dog's bowl and trudged outside. The garden was exactly how I feared. Overrun with snails. They were everywhere, clinging to the plants, slithering across the stones. I could barely handle it, but I had no choice. Rex needed his food, and I needed to get this over with. I bit my lip and forced myself to kneel, the feeling of panic rising with every second. Slowly, carefully, I put the dog's bowl down. As soon as I set the bowl down, the snails began to appear, like they were drawn to it. One by one, they slithered forward, their grotesque bodies glistening in the light. I tried to be brave, but the more I pulled off, the slower I became. My hands were shaking and I could feel my skin crawling just from being near them. Then, I felt it, an itch on my arm. I glanced down and my stomach lurched, a snail crawling up my arm. I swatted it away, but before I could react, I saw another one. Then 2, then 5, 10. They were all over me, covering my arms, my legs, creeping up my skin. I screamed, the bile rising in my throat as I tried to shake them off. I could feel them on me, sticking to my skin, their bodies pulsing as they moved. My head spun with nausea, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I had to get away. I bolted back inside, slamming the door behind me. My body was shaking uncontrollably, and I rushed to the bathroom, tearing off my clothes and jumping into the shower. I scrubbed my skin raw, trying to wash away the sensation of them crawling all over me. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, I could still feel them, like their slimy trails were burned into my skin. Mom! I whimpered as I emerged, wrapped in a towel. There were snails on me. They wouldn't stop. She looked at me unfazed.
You have to use salt. That's the only way to get rid of them. They hate it.
Salt, of course. Why hadn't I thought of that? My mother handed me a jar of salt, and I clutched it like a lifeline. The next time one of those things came near me, I'd be ready. That night, I placed the jar of salt on my bedside table, close enough to grab in an instant. I needed to know it was there, ready to protect me. I drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't long before I woke again. This time, it wasn't a nightmare. It was real. I felt it. A snail slowly making its way up my leg. My breath hitched, my muscles locking in place as terror gripped me. I didn't dare move. It inched higher, the cold, slimy weight crawling over my skin. With trembling hands, I reached for the jar of salt. My fingers closed around it, and I hurled the salt at the snail. For a moment, I thought it was working. The snail recoiled, its slimy body shrinking in on itself. But then, it grew. My breath caught in my throat as the snail began to expand, its body swelling and twisting. its eyes stretched out on long stalks, grotesque and bulging, while its mouth opened wide, dripping with thick, mucus-like fluid. And then I saw it, teeth, rows and rows of tiny, writhing teeth, emerging from the gooey maw as it gaped wider. I screamed, throwing more salt, but it didn't matter. My legs wouldn't move. My body frozen in terror as its mouth stretched impossibly wide. The last thing I saw were those eyes, gleaming with malice as it lunged forward. And then, nothing but darkness.
I woke up in a hospital bed. Someone had found me unconscious and brought me here. The sheriff had a million questions, but I had no answers. My story sounded like a madman's ramblings. I am a struggling musician, decided to take a personal vacation to the remote woods of northern Arizona. I was desperate to escape my creative block and the overwhelming malaise that had taken over my life. For 6 days, I immersed myself in nature, hoping to find solace and inspiration. But on the night of the 7th day, everything changed. It was around midnight when I was abruptly awakened by a noise. Groggily, I reached for my phone, which was ringing incessantly. I stared at the screen in confusion. There was no signal. So, how could my phone be ringing? The caller was unknown. Hesitantly, I answered, my voice barely a whisper. "Hello?" A voice, cold and urgent, came through the line.
You need to be ready. It knows you're there, and it's already here. It has come for you.
Who is this? Who am I speaking to? I asked, the exhaustion quickly leaving my voice, replaced by rising panic.
Be ready. It will be there soon. Don't open the door.
The line went dead, and my phone blinked with the words "signal lost." Before I could process what had just happened, a deafening boom echoed through the cabin. The walls shook, the windows rattled. I turned towards the bedroom door, my heart racing. The door was closed, but it was shaking violently, as if something was trying to break in. Boom, boom, boom. 3 knocks, each one more forceful than the last. The phone rang again, cutting through the noise. I grabbed it, my hands trembling. Another unknown caller. Shakily, I answered, not daring to speak.
It knows you're in there. It won't be polite for long. Get under the bed. Hide.
The line went dead again. With no time to lose, I crawled under the bed, my heart pounding in my ears. The door exploded. Shards of wood flew across the room, some embedding in my skin. I bit back a scream, tears streaming down my face from the pain. In the doorway stood a pair of feet, massive legs that looked like tree trunks, covered in mossy green and brown, with a texture so wooden it seemed inhuman. The creature's heavy, ragged breaths filled the room, along with the stench of rot and decay. It was a scent so putrid I had to cover my mouth and nose to keep from gagging. The creature circled the bed, its presence overwhelming. My blood ran cold as the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath as it let out a roar that shook me to my core, a sound like a mix of a jet engine's roar and a grizzly bear's growl. Just as it seemed the creature would flip the bed and find me, it stopped. It turned and lumbered out of the room. I released the breath I didn't know I was holding, my body shaking with relief and fear. The phone rang again and I answered it, my voice a desperate whisper. What was that? Who are you? How did you know it was coming?
There's no time. It knows where you are. You need to run. Jump out the window and keep running until you reach the highway. Don't come back until morning.
Are you insane? How can I outrun that thing?
You have to. It's the only way.
The line went dead. I didn't have time to think. I bolted toward the shattered window, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I dove through, slicing my arms and legs on the glass. Ignoring the pain, I ran. The creature was alerted and began to chase after me. Its massive body, reminiscent of Bigfoot, caused the ground to tremble with each step, and trees fell in its path. I ran through the forest, the sound of the creature's heavy, ragged breaths and the crunching of underbrush behind me. Its immense size made it terrifyingly fast, closing the distance between us quickly. I could feel its presence growing closer, the ground shaking more violently. I dared not look back. The creature roared again, a bone-chilling sound that spurred me to run even faster. Suddenly, the forest cleared, and I saw the faint glimmer of the highway lights ahead. The creature's footsteps grew louder, its breath hot on my back. I could almost feel its clawed hand reaching out to grab me. With a final burst of energy, I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the asphalt, collapsing in exhaustion. The creature stopped at the edge of the forest, its glowing eyes glaring at me from the darkness. It let out a frustrated roar, but did not step onto the road. I had made it to safety, but the terror of that night would haunt me forever. I woke up in a hospital bed. Someone had found me unconscious and brought me here. The sheriff had a million questions, but I had no answers. My story sounded like a madman's ramblings, but when they checked the cabin, they found the damage, claw marks in the wood like nothing they'd ever seen. They dismissed the phone calls, saying there was no cell service that far out. They thought I imagined it all. To this day, I don't know who called me or what that creature was, but I do know one thing. I am forever grateful to the unknown caller who saved my life.